Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics, the show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Grab a glass of whatever and join us as we dive deep into the origins, surprising mechanics, and tiny fine print of games you know or maybe you've never heard of. I am your host, Max, and joining me is my co-host, Troy. Working behind the scenes, of course, is our producer, Jay. And today's topic is the Avalon Hill game Starship Troopers, which is a very interesting game and an intriguing take on a unique and influential novel.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a game that followed that novel just over 20 years after the novel was released. And the game was designed by Randall C. Reed, and it's based on Robert A. Heinlein's 1959 novel of the same name. This game, it simulates various scenarios somewhat accurately or somewhat loosely based on the novel's plot, and it's focusing predominantly on the Mobile Infantry's battle against the Arachnids. So that's the Terran humans versus the bug-like aliens. This game, the original 1976 version, it's pretty complex, and it's known for its complexity and detailed rules. And that's pretty common for Avalon Hill's strategy games of that time and era. So it's right in the pocket of your hex and counter strategic war game. It even has a degree of an operational feel to it, but it's very tactical. It gives you a really interesting sci-fi tension and feeling, especially with the way the units interact and behave. It certainly leaves behind your conventional expectations. And I would say that it gives a really interesting take on what the novel presents.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely in the keeping of most Avalon Hill hex tile encounter games, but it has some interesting twists.
Absolutely.
I don't know that a lot of people would have the same patience for it, but if you are inclined to try it out, you can find copies of it on Tabletop Simulator. That's a thing I'm not officially spokesman for, but I'll make a point of that. And it's hard to find a reprint of it, but you could cobble together some printed versions. But the official version of the game is a boxed board game. It includes a map board, which is used for all of the encounters and scenarios that happen in the game. And it's kind of an odd thing where it has a mountain range that runs through, what would you say, like a third of the map? And then on one side, there's a desert, and on the other side, there's what they refer to as savanna. It comes with your standard, for this era and time, a bunch of little punch-out tiles. So card tiles with different unit indications that have, each unit has its damage, its defense, its movement, and a call number, especially with the Mobile Infantry ties to their control sheet. So the control sheet is a piece of paper that you use to tick off damage, so you can see where the complexity level is sort of sitting.
That's right.
And the alien player, so it is a somewhat asymmetrical game, has a hidden movement sheet. So they essentially have a paper duplicate of the board, and all of the hexes have call numbers in a way that is very old Avalon Hill game that I don't like, where it uses numbers and letters, but the letters exceed the number that is the maximum, so they start duplicating the letters. Anyway, you'll have to look at the board to get what I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely.
So the idea is that the alien player, their advantage in the game is that they have hidden movement and can use either tunnels to work their way under the opponent, or if they're playing the humanoid aliens, they have decoys. And there's a whole range of game aids and a rule book, obviously, that has, in true Avalon Hill and even SPI fashion, 3-column printing with super tiny type.
It's pretty readable, but yeah, you're right. It's dense.
Yeah, it's got to be at least 10 point, which is right on the edge of easy read, but definitely on the small side. Oh, and it comes with a 6-sided die, which is used to resolve combat.
On a classic combat resolution table.
Yes, it uses tables, and we'll get into that.
So it's a hex-based game. That's the main thing to take away, because it will both meet and not meet your expectations on that based on your experience with those games. But it employs both surface and subterranean combat, and that's largely represented through that control sheet that Max was just talking about, as that's going to be how the Arachnid player is going to maneuver things through tunnels.
And I've seen some interesting ways that people who own the game have increased the playability and communication with the opponent player. So the one that I'd seen is someone had set a piece of plexiglass over the board so that they could actually draw the tunnels onto the map as the opponent found them.
Right. That's really cool.
But otherwise, you have to kind of communicate to the other player where your tunnels are, and there are markers for that. And the emergence of where those bug units will actually appear in the game. Playing the humanoid player is a little easier, but it does use a lot of the same kind of two-board hidden actions, and there's some interesting strategy.
Yeah, as the mobile infantry, you have a control sheet that is a breakdown of your platoon, and it shows you all the different sections and each trooper within, and then they are tracked with individual gear loadouts and individual status.
To the credit of this game, and in fact a lot of Avalon Hill games, and also by this era any other competitors with Avalon Hill, they understand that the rules and complexity of these games is a bit challenging. So what they did is they tailor, and this no different in this game, they tailor each scenario to add a level of complexity to the rules. Troy and I actually played the first scenario, which, to kind of tie back to some of how the game is put together, each scenario kind of follows the encounters verbatim from the book, but then it elaborates them in such a way that kind of strays from that, but it uses each encounter in the book as a starting point for all 8 scenarios. And each of the 8 scenarios then adds another tactical layer to the game.
That's right. The first turn there, the first gradually introduced scenario is largely a hex encounter game with sci-fi units. It's not until you get into scenarios 2 and 3 that you're really seeing what makes the Arachnid player really different. And then you're, into a very different feeling game as opposed to fighting the humanoid aliens.
Yeah, it feels a lot less asymmetrical in the very first scenario.
That's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, and there's no special weapons. There's no special damage, which is a big thing for the Federation units. And the alien player is somewhat at a disadvantage aside from the surprise element. Initial placement for the first scenario on the alien player side is pretty crucial, and you're probably going to lose. Anyway.
Yeah, it's an uphill battle as the humanoid, because you've got an entire section of power armor jumpers coming in to wreck your everything. And they're pretty equipped to do it.
Yeah, just as a point, so the game is measured in hexes, and movement is essentially based on those hexes. So the movement rating of a unit is how many hexes it moves. I think I've thoroughly explained that. The Marauders, which are the basic units of the mobile infantry, move 6 hexes on their movement phase. The alien humanoids move 2.
Yes, huge difference.
Yeah. So moving 3 times the speed of your opponent will have a pretty distinct advantage. So the element of surprise is pretty much what the humanoid aliens have, pretty much what they're have on their side.
Yeah, they have diversion, they have decoys, and you rely on that to make the Terran Federation Marauder units waste time by going to blank hex tiles or attacking low-value, low-priority targets. And it's a tricky balance, because once the mobile infantry get to where they're going, they're gonna pretty much win the firefight every time.
Yeah. Later on, there are scenarios that reintroduce the humanoids with long-range weapons, which we'll get into.
Effectively artillery, right?
Yeah. So the way that combat is resolved in most cases is all units occupying the same hex then go through a combat phase, which has to resolve. But we'll come around that when we talk about combat and movement. So each turn, and that's a full turn broken into 2 phases for each player, is equivalent to 12 minutes, which, that gives you a sense of some scale of the game.
I love a good time scale. Like in my war games, I want to know what a turn is. So when I'm on turn 4, I know how long this has taken. I don't know why that's important to me, but I love it.
I'd say it's an immersion thing. I also think that might be especially important in a game that's as abstract as this. Basically, gameplay involves a lot of pre-planning and paperwork to some degree.
The setup phase for the alien player is significant.
Yeah, we had to play the scenario twice because I didn't understand the advantages immediately without actually playing it. And that's pretty typical of me. I usually like to play the game badly once, and then I get a better sense of how that all meshes together. The second time I still lost, but it was a lot less of a one-sided fight.
Yeah, I walked away with a lot more damage on that one. That's for dang sure.
Yeah, I definitely took out more of your units. So I think that was a good lesson in how to strategize. But I really did get the sense, even the second time playing, that I'm not really meant to win that. This is more of a training exercise.
Yeah, it is. 100%. It's boot camp.
That all aside, I think we can get into the function, more into the meat and potatoes of how the game actually plays.
And I would say they do another thing I love by giving me a concrete ground scale, because each of these hexes represent 1 mile on the map board where the units will move hex by hex up to their maximum allowance. And these movement allowances will be modified and affected by terrain for how far a unit can get up to.
Right, yeah. And as we had mentioned, units can vary quite a bit based on how much they can move.
That's right.
The Federation mobile infantry can move much faster than either the Arachnids or the humanoids. The Arachnids do have some interesting advantages, though, mostly in their attack power and defense. So you're using slower ambush units against very fast, and I guess they were just playing into the idea that it's the mobile infantry. And in the book, these are power armored, almost diving suit-esque battle systems that each soldier wears that have an entire array of weapons and jetpacks, effectively. They can basically fly short distances or jump.
Yeah, I like to imagine it as a great leap.
Yeah, but we're talking like really like huge leaps. But you're right, they do kind of bound across the landscape, or at least that's the implication I got from reading it.
Yeah, me too.
So let's get into the combat now, which is maybe the stickiest part. And we screwed this up a whole bunch of times. So the game makes you do some not super fun head math regarding ratios and fractions.
Right, because it is comparative odds, right?
So the table is broken into, if you imagine a table, you have 6 results that can be rolled on your 6-sided die. And then across the top is the ratio of attack power to defense power based on what units are attacking what other units.
That's right.
So now it's important to keep in mind that the total attack power of all of the attacking units can be divided among any of the targets however you want. So you can have, say, every unit had 2 and you had 3 units. That would be a firepower of 6. And you could attack 2 units with 3 power each. Now, whether that would be enough to overwhelm its defense, that's the other half of this. So the fractional element of this is you have to divide the attack power by the defense, and the number of times that you can put the attack power into the defense is the ratio of advantage that you have on the table. So that's the top of the table. So it's, 1 to 2, so 1 being the attack and 2 being the defense, to 1 to 1, to 2 to 1, to 3 to 1, and so on. And it's not that math is super difficult, but fractions are never... I don't think I've ever met anybody except for really nerdy mathematicians that are super into doing fractions in their head.
Right.
Which, again, it's totally doable, but it's you do get used to it, but it does slow down things a little bit when you're like, oh, and we got it wrong a number of times.
Yeah, we were a little bit newbie about this when we came in because we were totaling it wrong. But once we remembered Oh, right. Okay. This is an old-fashioned hex encounter game. We're doing comparative odds, and we took the time to do it. It clicked, and we were able to make it work. The thing is, with the mobile infantry, they're so powerful that even with the odds being wrong, they can still win fights.
Oh, yeah.
So it's kind of hilarious. But it's not until the later scenarios that you really see the mobile infantry stretched, when they have opponents that can outflank them, outmaneuver them. They have people that can shoot across multiple hexes, and that really puts the pressure on. Because combat occurs between opposing units in the same hex. And that's where those attack and defense strengths come in, where you generate those comparative odds. So you have to think of a hex as being a mile. So it's not just one unit fits into it. You have stacking limits. So you can fit multiple mobile infantry and limited numbers of aliens. And then when they collide in the same hex, that's when you resolve the combat. And because these are 12-minute turns, that's where I get that operational feeling from, because you're more setting up the positional aspects of your attack. You're not tactically moving rock to rock in the seconds of a gunfight, you know what I mean, trying to blast aliens.
Yeah.
It's a lot more like positional play, using the terrain to your advantage to set up an attack. And I found when we played our scenarios, advancing in a skirmish order that then collapsed into concentrations of strength really worked. But you had to do it thinking of a big picture in your mind and not thinking of it like you're some squad leader or platoon commander, even though you are in the game, however.
Yeah, you want to have that very high view, and you really want to keep the objective in mind, because you got bogged down in fights that you probably didn't need to get bogged down into.
100%.
So that, just to give a sense of what the objective of the first scenario is, for example, is that the points are given to the Federation player for each infrastructural target. So power plants, water towers, communication arrays give the highest number of points. Then the lower number of points is given to combatant units, so alien soldiers. And then you actually get negative points for hurting effectively civilians, which is, I understand why that is actually now from going through the book again, but we can get more of that into the lore. But it does seem weird when you're playing it. It's like, oh, why wouldn't I just blow everybody up? I mean, from a wargaming point of view.
It's true. It is different in your expectations, and it kind of leads to these moments where you, as the attacker, as the mobile infantry, have to be thoughtful about what you engage, because you might just accidentally hit a worker unit and incur a victory point loss. So it is an interesting push-pull mechanic. But the one thing I noted is it didn't really thematically fit with the way that first chapter reads, because they do just take out their targets, with a great deal of prejudice in that first chapter. Like, you know what I'm saying? So
to mirror it onto the opening chapter of the book, what their objective is to unload as much ammunition into everything they could possibly see in the middle of an alien city. And this feels a lot more controlled and, dare I say, peacekeeper-esque.
Yes, it's got a much different tenor to it, which I think works.
Yeah, it makes the game more interesting, for sure.
It does. And it doesn't even introduce the range combat yet, because that comes in a later scenario with the humanoids. But those are ranged weapons that can attack enemy units from a distance, or with, line of sight considerations through terrain, for example. That's all included. But effectively, that's how this game works. That's the basic elements. And once you have played the first scenario or the first two scenarios a few times, you should have a really good understanding of what the game's going to, I guess, require you to think like to be successful. Because when you're the Terrans, you have, or the humans, you've got mobile infantry and combat engineers. You're in power armor suits, and some people have scout armor, and some people have marauder armor. The marauders are your line troops, they're the heavy dudes, and then you've got your light troops, your scouts, and your commanders who are wearing the scout armor. And they're a little more fragile, but they can move 10 hexes compared to the 6 hexes of a marauder. So if you need to get into the rear, if you need to start flipping those tiles and seeing what their contents are before you launch attacks with your marauders, your scouts are going to be key for this. So They're really interesting as a force, the Terrans, and they also get access to special weapons like high explosives and delayed action charges, and that's what your character sheet to the side of your map board is for, right? Because you'll be tracking on that, who's expended what and who's sustained what damage.
Yeah, there's also on the chart that reads, so the attack chart for the human player, the way that damage is denoted is either, so you determine what the odds are based on the amount of firepower or attack going in on that target. Oh, this is another thing that kind of caught us off guard. So it's the defending player that rolls the effect of what's happened. I mean, either player could roll it, but it's when you're shooting at somebody, you just declare you're firing and by what proportion of firepower is hitting what unit. And then you roll for each unit based on the defense aspect. So it's a defender rolls situation. On each of those results from the D6 and the corresponding ratio of attack power and defense, for the human player, there are different levels of damage. So there's a miss, which makes up a good chunk of a lot of the results. And then there's a stun, a light hit, a heavy hit, and then an out of action, effectively, level of damage. In the first scenario, they simplify this to have it so that the light damage is a stun and the heavy damage is an out of action. But when you're playing with the full rules, a light hit actually damages equipment. So you can actually damage the arsenal of a unit.
That's right. And
heavy damage can basically permanently hobble a unit so that now a lot of its movement or attack power is permanently, like it's essentially its basic stats are reduced. And then the out of action works the same way as it would normally.
Right.
And that adds a lot of texture to the game, but strangely that only applies to the human player. The alien player only has 3 states that it could possibly be when it's attacked. So it's a miss, it's a stun, or it's an elimination. And then there's combat engineers, which are sometimes just referred to as special units. The token is very weirdly inexplicit, like it doesn't even have an image on it, if I remember. And they can detect things like burrowing tunnels and sometimes units at distance, but they're mainly there as a way to sort of scope out and detect things. And then the other unit, I'm not sure that you mentioned, were leader units as well.
Oh, yes. We want to make sure that you mention leader units. In the first scenarios, they don't have any additional considerations or powers, but they're important for your essential command and control mechanics of the game. And they're also something that the Arachnids and humanoids do not have. That's a Terran thing.
I can understand why the Arachnids don't, because they effectively are a hive mind. I don't know why there aren't leader units for the humanoids, but they only appear in like 2 out of the 8 scenarios. I might be wrong about that. They might be in 3, but yeah. But then we can move on to the Arachnid units, which are... So if you've seen the movie, you're going to get a very weird perspective of what the Arachnid units are actually like, because these are much closer to the book, which are not described in the kind of detail you'd expect, but there are soldiers, which are basically big tank-like bugs, and they attack enemies at the same range that the mobile infantry would with their basic weapons. So it's on the same hex. There are worker bugs, which are responsible for the tunneling aspect. And then there are heavy weapons. And now this is the part that if you read the book first, it might not seem that weird, though it does make the bugs seem pretty strange. But the bugs have beam cannons that can shoot at pretty long ranges. And they also have... Well, I mean, in the movie, they do show that they shoot those sort of sporing anti-orbital batteries into the stratosphere. In the way they're described in the book, they almost seem like the bugs are sort of hybridized versions of technology and biology. They're almost cyborg-esque, but they're not really described that way either. But they do use lasers. So yeah, you can, as the Arachnids, you can get artillery, effectively. In fact, the Arachnids also get nukes.
Oh, wow.
Which is also the main attack arsenal for... Oh, and the skinnies get nukes as well. The skinnies being, of course, the humanoid aliens.
Right, yes.
The derogative terms for the humanoids are the skinnies, and the derogative term for the Arachnids are the bugs.
That's right, yeah.
In the novel.
The humanoid units, they get a lot of similar things to the other guys, but you're right, they also get their own expanded arsenal.
Yeah, in the next... I don't remember which counter it comes in what order, but a later encounter with the skinnies has a much heavier arsenal where they have effectively missile batteries that can shoot nukes at long range. Tiny nuclear warheads play a big role in the book, and they also play a noticeable role in this game where they also come in different sizes. So there's an actual size scale. So the smallest of these is a single hex at range. So you can fire it from multiple hexes away, and it'll basically hit everything in that hex, I think including your own units. And then the next one is the single hex with every hex around it. And there's a damage band. So you could consider it a hot and warm zone.
Right.
And then there's another one that its main target, and these are very limited, like the super nukes. I don't think they're called that, but that's what I'm calling them. Essentially are an instant death to whatever hex it lands on, a hot zone surrounding it, and a warm zone surrounding that. And you might get one of those in a scenario. Some of the expansion scenarios, which there's at least one in Avalon Hill's, House Organ magazine, The General, has a scenario that expands upon the game. There's also another expansion called Alone Against the Bugs, which is a solo game, which apparently is quite popular. And then there's a whole bunch of other scenarios that people have made recently. There is a sort of community around this game. It's definitely an interesting take on those. But some of those scenarios involve like multiple super nukes. And that's an interesting proposition from what I've seen and what they actually do.
Well, the scenarios will give you different objectives too. Like sometimes you're capping or capturing areas, or sometimes you're destroying units. So these special pieces of hardware will have different utilities depending on whatever scenario you might be in across the offerings of the game.
There's a nice range of, as I said, it builds the complexity. It's actually fun to kind of revisit a lot of these as well. Like each one plays of its own accord. They're sort of like a separate game with the same rules in a lot of ways.
Right.
And I mean, that's kind of what you'd imagine a fixed scenario to be. And there's a lot of flexibility. Like even in the first one, humanoid alien player can place units, I think, within 18 hexes of the city, which is a fixed part of the map in one corner, and can lay out their defenses quite liberally across a wide range of terrain. Whether that's a good thing or not, there is I don't want to call it a degenerative strategy in some cases, but there's definitely an optimal way to handling things. And so your ability to reinforce, so you might not want to be too loose, unless you're playing some crazy meta strategy where you're trying to fake out your opponent by having them go toward a bunch of decoys.
Yeah, unless you're refusing a flank or something.
Yeah, exactly. The victory conditions for a lot of these scenarios is a victory point style system, which changes based on the scenario. So, as we were saying in the first one, it's awarded by units, captured or destroyed. I didn't mention for the alien player, the most number of points you can get is by killing the opponent's leader. And you get more points for killing each of their soldiers, but I can tell you from experience, that's a lot harder than you think.
It really is.
To get any kind of serious advantage on the mobile infantry with the humanoids, you need 4 infantry alien units to get a 2-to-1 on a single mobile infantry.
And that's your stacking limit too.
Yeah, that's the max. So yeah, we probably get into stacking limits because it sounds super unbalanced, but it isn't necessarily in practice. But the stacking limit for the mobile infantry player is unlimited. So you can stack as many marauders into one space as you want. That doesn't mean you have that many, though some scenarios do use up to like 20 or 30 units.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah. But the alien, both the Arachnid and the humanoid aliens, have various stacking limits. The humanoid one being 4. But they also get other advantages like stronghold installations, which when occupied give the defenses 9. And in this game, that's a lot. Like, as soon as I started taking advantage of those defensive protocols, you were having a much harder time killing me.
100%.
It progresses nicely, and it becomes a much more competitive game as you go into it, especially using the Arachnids and the tunneling ambush mechanics are really interesting, albeit a bit confusing because the Arachnid player secretly knows where the tunnels are, and so it's you have to trust me, bro kind of gameplay.
Yes.
One way that I was thinking about it that made it make a little bit more sense is whoever's playing the alien player is kind of the game master.
Yeah, they're almost like running the game in almost like an adventure board game Descent way, if you know what I'm trying to reference, right?
Yeah.
Where the other player is the protagonist and the GM takes on the antagonist perspective.
I think there must be at least another Avalon Hill game that I can't recall that does that. But in fact, a lot of them are pretty even. Like they might have like, oh, we're playing a World War II game and the Germans get this advantage and the Americans get this advantage. But they're more of a competitive fight rather than a story-based scenario. But this game is very much a story-based scenario. It is possible, especially after the first scenario, for the alien player to win.
100%.
But there is this sort of decided advantage that the mobile infantry have that gets played up more and more. And you do feel that you're, to use a Dungeons and Dragons reference, you're playing the goblin horde.
Yeah.
When you're playing the aliens. So you're like, oh, it's more about numbers for me. It's not so much about how mobile or the, even as I said, like the fact that the mobile infantry have multiple types of damage states and the aliens are basically, oh, well, they're suppressed or they're dead. That kind of says it all right there.
It really does. And to move on to how this game kind of plays more than just the way that the rules work, is you really have to take into consideration the effect of terrain and the way that you have to move over it and the way that it's going to change the combat effectiveness of units within it. So mountains and roads have really interesting relationships because mountains will slow you right down and roads will allow you to cut through. However, the humanoids can get a real advantage to actually fighting in the mountains where the mobile infantry don't.
Yeah. I would say that's one of the areas where the game kind of turns on the mobile infantry player is by way of the terrain. So, for instance, roads and cities, well, to be fair, roads don't do anything to help the mobile infantry. But if you're playing the humanoid aliens, you move 4 times as fast on a road.
It's a big deal.
Yeah. In the cities, the mobile infantry treats it like rough terrain, but you get a much higher advantage for defense if you're the humanoids. Maybe that's where the balance comes in, because to move on to the tunnel warfare, the Arachnids can basically bypass all kinds of terrain by tunneling. And then they get the surprise advantage by popping out and attacking when you don't expect it. And the only response that the mobile infantry can have to this are by collapsing those tunnels and forcing that player to attack from a different point.
Yeah, drop a bomb down the bug hole, right? Classic.
Yeah, or that's another function that the engineers serve, is to close those holes if you don't have basically if you can't nuke the front of it.
Exactly.
It's also worth pointing out that nukes leave radiation, so you can actually burn out areas. I'm not super fond of the original counter for that because it just looks like a sort of black charred blob, when I would have preferred like a radiation sign, because I just don't assess. I guess it's meant to look like the ground is burnt.
Yes.
But everything else in the game is very symbolic. Like the counters have these like pretty distinctive thing. One variant, the variant that we were playing with, Jay kept thinking that this is on the original one in the rule book. Jay kept thinking that the humanoid soldier unit looked like he was giving him gang signs because of the weird posturing of the arms.
Oh, yes.
Because it's in a silhouette. And it was like, what is it doing? It looks like it's doing some kind of strange dance move or something.
100%. It is not a natural pose, we'll say.
I mean, this goes back to the printing technology at the time. The fidelity of pieces and what you could put on them to a certain size was limited by the printability of that. So getting an easy read silhouette on your unit to identify what unit it would be wasn't based on detail. It was just like, oh yeah, that looks different from that guy, and this looks like a guy holding a gun. I know in a lot of other games, I think they're more SPI games, but they tend to put more characters in profile. And when SPI starts doing them, it's a little later on, though that would not be a factor with this game because it came out around the same time that they would be competing with each other as companies. There's different ways. They have different artists and different designers for handling those things. I just thought it was interesting that like, oh, that's a guy with a jump pack? Okay, it looks like a guy in a Superman pose. Oh, okay, I kind of get that.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, so let's talk about the special functions of...
Oh, yes, okay.
We kind of been hinting at this, but...
Yeah, but both sides have special phases for deploying, detonating explosives, setting up defenses, and using their specialized gear and equipment. And how this works is, effectively, you'll conduct an entire player's phase and then move on to the next player's phase in the turn. So it does kind of have a classic I go, you go mentality to the turn structure, and then you go through your steps of each turn, moving your troops, conducting your combats, etc.
Yeah, so there's I guess there's two main phases, but there's a sort of third special phase. So yeah, there's movement, then you go through and see any units that are in conflict, or if they're in range of your weapons, then you can determine to resolve those conflicts. And then there's a phase for any kind of special actions that happen after that. And the fun part about that being a separate phase, and we found this even in the first scenario that doesn't actually have that, is that it gives time for the opponent player to then stop what's happening or try to reinforce something to prevent a crisis, because a lot of those special phases are not immediate. In the case where you were capturing particular infrastructure units, you had to end the round to capture them. So I could actually reinforce them, giving me a little bit of an advantage.
Yeah, exactly.
One that I didn't take nearly as much as I could have, but I definitely saw that by the time I finished playing. I was like, oh yeah, I could have backed that spot up and then actually made it really difficult for you. Yeah, and then there's the engineers being able to breach and destroy tunnel systems, and obviously the inversion of that with the worker bugs being able to breach in an attacking fashion to destroy the human player.
That's right. And the engineers and the worker bugs give, again, that bigger picture feeling where you're not just doing a gunfight. You know, you're actually looking at something a little bit more, not just to repeat myself, but kind of more of an operational structure, you know, where you're just looking at how you're going to go ahead and tackle not just, you know, a fight for a farm, but a fight for a whole city.
That's kind of what the strange 2-level combat and sort of decoying and second guessing the opponent is a lot of what makes this game unique and different from, say, games like Squad Leader or any of the naval games that they had put out, where sometimes they have something where, oh, I don't know what that is until I actually run into it. But a lot of the time it's a bit more of there's more parity in the fight. You know, each side they might be different, but they're basically the same. And it's more about your strategic ability as opposed to, oh, this player is really different in how they attack and they have certain advantages. And this player has very different advantages in another way. But that's the game in a nutshell. I mean, it is a board game and it does have a level of complexity to it, but it's actually pretty approachable. I'd recommend this one if anyone wanted to get into this.
It's worth playing. Getting
into this kind of a game. This is not a bad place to start. And it certainly walks you through the game in a friendly way, as friendly as it can be.
Those introductory scenarios do a great job of getting you in the game, getting you acclimatized to your player expectations. And then when you play the Mobile Infantry, by the end of the first game, you really should have a good grasp of what you're doing.
Yeah.
When you're playing the humanoids or the Arachnids, it might take a session or two to click into the uniqueness of how they operate, because the Mobile Infantry are just like super soldiers, right? You know, they do what soldiers do. They fly around, they kick the crap out of stuff. But the other factions, you really need to find their strengths and play hard to them, because they won't necessarily win any stand-up fights.
Yeah, one criticism that I have is that the difference between the humanoid and the Arachnid is such. They do have some similarities in certainly their movement speeds and their attack powers, though the Arachnids definitely hit harder. But the way they strategically function flips around so much, it's very hard for the alien player, if they're consistently playing one side, to really, there's a shift in strategy that happens quite rapidly. And oh, I just figured out how to play the humanoids. Okay, I kind of figure out what the strategy for this scenario is. Now we're in scenario 2. This is totally different. But the human player is still playing with a lot of the same strategy they were in the last scenario.
Yeah.
That's my one gripe about this, is that, yeah, the one player, but again, if you think of them more like the GM, that doesn't seem too bad. That's about all I could say about the rules. It's still fun. One thing you might do is play a scenario and then play it again with the roles reversed. As we do with all of our games, if it pertains to this, but certainly there's an implication in all games that there is lore. We get around to talking about the book, and in some ways how it's represented in the game. Each scenario starts with a direct quote from the book. So it's fair to say that taking the book as source material for this game makes some sense. So I'll very briefly go through the book. Now, I'm going to start by saying this. If you are looking for a fun, action-packed, military sci-fi story about humans fighting aliens, I probably wouldn't recommend this one, because what Heinlein has done for this book is taken what is basically a military SF short story and then mixed in his personal political philosophy into it, which makes the book a bit opaque and kind of dry. It's still really interesting, but not in the way that you would think.
I would recommend John Stakely's Armor from the 80s as a really fun power armor smash 'em up book. And it's pretty grim and nihilistic and kind of tough, so it's a fun one.
Yeah, and if I was recommending one and you wanted something a little bit more cerebral and thinky, The Forever War. It's a very weird kind of sci-fi as far as like the technology, but its plot is very interesting. And it definitely talks about themes in a much more sort of cohesive way than Starship Troopers does. So the novel is set in the future, if you hadn't guessed, and Earth society is a sort of limited franchise republic that is global. And in order to get the right to vote, you have to serve in the military, or at least the military is the basis of the government, but there is some sort of civil servant jobs that kind of fall out of that. And the reason for this that Heinlein gives is more for a principle of loyalty to the country itself. Well, the country is the planet, and presumably other planets which are implied. This is a big thing about this book. There's a lot of things that are implied but not specifically said, which makes it interesting to decode, but difficult to read and get the message that's being presented. In order to be in military service, there's a voluntary, like military service is voluntary, but it does have this thing where, oh, I can have a say in political matters. But you really get the sense that not a lot of people care about that because their rights are protected by a constitution. I think the best way that I've understood it is that having the right to vote in that world is the equivalent of being a politician in our world. Except you have proven this by serving in the military and doing your time, I guess. It's important to remember that the themes, I don't know if they get hit. They either get hit really heavily and up front, or they kind of get lost in the plot of what's happening. But they're essentially about duty and citizenship and what it means to be part of the whole of a nation and what you owe to it and how do you prove that. So one of my favorite things in the book is that they have this in the recruiting. They basically say the only thing that keeps you from taking military service is an inability to recite the oath. But the society is based around an idea of voluntarism. So I don't know, some people have called it libertarian. I think that's not quite right because that would imply that there's very little government. I don't get the sense that there's little government. It's just very specific government.
Yeah, it's kind of like a space military, and it's not a small military because it's pretty vast and they have a lot of strength. They have a fleet, they have the mobile infantry. I don't know what other branches of service they have, but it's kind of implied that it's a big tent with a lot of dudes in it.
Yeah.
And you do see this through the perspective of a central character, of a protagonist in this book. So even though it's written sort of, as a military sci-fi fiction story and also a personal treatise on the author's views on things or certain things, it does still have one Johnny Rico as your central protagonist who narrates his journey from high school to becoming an infantryman in the Mobile Infantry and all that he goes through in that process.
Yeah, and a lot of the encounters that happen in the book, and this is the other confusing thing about the book, is that it jumps in time forward and backwards in various places that sometimes leave readers that don't finish the book confused or misunderstanding other scenes that are explained later. But yeah, it's about Rico's advancement through these different ranks, and then he becomes like the head of the unit, and then they do the final battle, and then they find out there's a central thinking bug, which is basically like a computer, and all of its tactical decisions are based on that. And when they destroy/capture that, basically when they make that realization, they now have a huge tactical advantage. There's even a part of the book where they have an expeditionary force where they go and find out that, oh, the bugs are actually like more intelligent than we thought they were. They're not just weird mutated things with guns stuck to them. Though I honestly, anything that shoots lasers at stuff from its body, I don't think things evolve that way.
Yeah.
So I don't know why they assume it's like, oh yeah, that's just how they are. I mean, they're alien, so maybe that's the assumption.
But the book does something very interesting based on the personal life experience of Robert A. Heinlein as being someone who served in the Navy in the Second World War. This actually has a real, like life in the barracks type of feeling as you go with Rico through his training and how that proceeds. And there's a certain, I don't know how to refer to it, maybe groundedness that kind of comes from the fact that this guy experienced that type of lifestyle in a personal way. So when he writes about it, there's a certain authority that he manages to convey in what it's like to just be kind of stuck in a barracks and being bored and then having to go out and train and then go through crazy high stress situations.
I mean, it's worth remembering that a lot of the books that he had originally started writing were youth fiction sci-fi stories. So they were essentially Boy Scout novels set in space.
Right.
And a lot of what I see the barracks and the training part, it reads a lot like those other stories, like Have Spacesuit Will Travel. But in this case, it's a bit more adult. Those early stories of his are sort of like the boy adventurer stories. And then in this case, it's a young man who's becoming an adult and he's stepping into the military role in order to fulfill that.
And they do, in a physical sense, step into powered armor suits as the Mobile Infantry. And that's what defines that as a fighting force, right? Is they're power armored. And this is, I don't know if it's the first appearance of power armor in fiction, but it's kind of the first one that I'm immediately familiar with.
It's accredited as being at least the most notable example, because I think he based a lot of his thoughts on this on the advancement of military technology, and they kind of resemble deep sea diving suits.
They do, with longer weird arms.
Like, they're basically like mechanized gorillas.
I just love the art in the book, or the depiction in the book does not match the art in the game book. It's hilarious.
It doesn't, not even close.
They look like the Michelin Man, and they have and just what it tells you about the suit. Like if you think of like a Warhammer power armor man, there'll be like all the things like Coginator and all these like badass crazy words, to describe all the gear. For the power armor suit in this game, insulated boots.
Yep. Yeah, it's very early sci-fi, matter of fact kind of. Oh yeah, that's a thing we didn't have in World War II. I bet that's a neat idea to have in the future.
Wouldn't it be neat if your toes were warm?
Yeah, right? In fact, I hated having cold toes.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to say it sounds domestic a lot of the time, but there's something very like too grounded about it.
Yeah, exactly.
If such a thing can be thought of, yes. So here's one of those bizarre time jump things. So it starts off with, as the first scenario of the game starts off, with an attack on a humanoid, skinny city where they're basically just doing a shock and awe tactical attack. The objective, which Rico states, is to expend as much ammunition as possible and to as many viable targets, which is why that flies in the face of you getting negative points for killing workers, because that does not seem to be a concern.
Yeah, and the book doesn't really explain the context of why this mission's happening until way later. So it just sort of has a really abrupt kind of like, whoa, are we just wasting these guys? Kind of a start. The further you get along, the book doesn't, we won't say it justifies it, but it certainly gives you a reasoning.
Yeah, it gives you more context. Because when you're first reading it, it seems like straight war crimes.
Yeah, it does.
Level of combat. It's not too flattering. But later on, you find out that the humanoid skinny aliens are allied with the bugs. How that alliance actually works is not super described. Some people have alluded to the idea that it might be just two comparable forces against the same force, but there does seem to be a bit more cooperation because later in the book, the skinnies flip and fight for the Federation, and that's part of what gives some advantage to the final battle. The skinnies don't really get talked about that much.
No, they're a sideshow. The main antagonists are the Arachnids, and those are the highly aggressive insect-like aliens. And the first combat experience that Rico gets is a drop on an Arachnid-controlled planet, and it's brutal.
And symbolically, in the political side, they're meant to represent collectivism, which Heinlein was pretty expressly against.
Yeah, he had different views for sure, and he was, I mean, that's part of this book, is that it is sort of like his version of trying to write a philosophy book, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, because it's fiction, a lot of people draw a lot of misconceptions from it, and he doesn't really make his point that well. If you're willing to read it pretty rigorously, you can get these things, but it's almost like reading two books that are smashed together.
Yeah, it's strange. I find that when he just writes a sci-fi short story, he's in his bag and he's doing it, you know? But when he's trying to espouse his more personal views, it gets more complicated and messy, and it's just not as well structured.
I feel like he'd make his point better if he wrote an essay.
Yeah, I could understand that.
But his medium was fiction. He may have thought that no one would have read it.
Isn't that the same thing with 1984, though, right? Where he just was like, wow, no one's taking this serious, so why don't I just write a fiction book and then put my views in the middle of that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. But I think Orwell's better at doing that.
Yes, I would agree for sure.
It doesn't feel like we're having two conversations about what's happening and what that means.
Yeah.
I will say, like, the action parts of Starship Troopers are really interesting. They're really good. The descriptions and the movement, although it has that very, like, I don't know how to call it twee, but like this sort of like idyllic 1940s kind of view of the future and its creature comforts, but then in a war situation, other than that kind of weird undertone that it has to it, which is just kind of just dating it a little. It's actually pretty action-packed. I think that's what some people gravitated to, and then I guess they just ignored the rest of it. Because obviously, power armor, presumably if it comes from this, and I haven't seen any evidence to say otherwise, it clearly took off, so people were reading it. I don't know that anyone cared about the argument that he has with his family, or the weird lectures that he gets from the the training commanders and stuff, like the people in the training camp.
From Sergeant Teacher, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or when his commanding officer, though that's more sort of bravado-y stuff. But it just feels like a different book at times. A friend of mine who had also read it, and we sometimes have conversations about it, we both agreed that it feels like several different short stories kind of strapped together by chapter.
It does. That's not wrong at all.
So yeah, in the end, the book ends with Rico fully embracing his role as a career member of the military, and they presumably keep fighting the bugs. But now they have all these advantages about what they know about them and all this, so it sounds like they're going to win.
For Buenos Aires! And then in 97, so much later, 20 years or 21 years later, Avalon Hill released a redesigned version called Starship Troopers Prepare for Battle, and that's based on the Verhoeven film.
We won't get into the details about how similar that is to the book and where it deviates, but the fact that the game was remade, it's important to point out that had changed as well.
And it simplified the rules, and it focused it more on a squad level thing, as opposed to the bigger picture that this game captured, in sort of that classic Hex Encounter style. But That would be Starship Troopers. That's the game. That's the book that it came from. And if you are looking for something where you want to get some hidden movement down, some hex and counter action, it is a game that's worth sourcing and playing. And there's a lot of fun to be had. And going into next week, we've got a very exciting topic that we've been waiting to get to. So we're really looking forward to dive in.
So we're doing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, first edition. And we're going to break this into 2 pieces. So the first one will be on the Player's Handbook, and then the next one will be on the Dungeon Master's Guide. And those will be kind of back-to-back 2-part, in the same schedule, of course.
So we're looking forward to getting that out to all of you as soon as we can as well.
And until then, happy gaming, and always be out there trying new things or old things. And have a good one.
Have a good one, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.